The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.
A special legislative committee hears more today about how Idaho might deal with hazardous waste disposal. But Owyhee County residents still concerned about the EnviroSafe site say more needs to be done right now.
I feel like they should not be accepting any waste at all out there until they know for sure exactly what's going on and whether the groundwater is being contaminated or not.
Good evening. A special Idaho legislative committee studying the problems associated with hazardous waste disposal in this state decided today that it is not yet ready to recommend specific legislation and will meet one more time before making specific proposals available to the Idaho legislature. We'll talk tonight with the co-chairman of that committee about what that committee has discussed so far. Meanwhile, county commissioners in Owyhee County, the home of the EnviroSafe hazardous waste disposal facility, aren't waiting for state action. They passed last night an ordinance assessing a 1 cent per pound fee on waste disposed of at the EnviroSafe facility. The commissioners also want monthly reports of what's being disposed of there and where it's coming from. We'll talk with the Owyhee County prosecuting attorney about that. We'll also hear tonight from the top federal Environmental Protection Agency official in Idaho and with a spokesman from the EnviroSafe company. First, though, the legislative committee action here in Boise today. This legislative committee was formed as concern began to grow about that EnviroSafe facility in Owyhee County. But the committee's real job is to make recommendations that cover a wide range of hazardous waste concerns in the state. The committee heard first today from Idaho Health and Welfare Environmental Chief Lee Stokes, who outlined the general areas of legislation lawmakers might consider. One, of course, is raising revenue to finance either dealing with hazardous waste emergencies or additional regulation of hazardous waste disposal. Stokes also suggested that the state might want to consider control of transportation of waste, specific state legislation dealing with liability for hazardous waste accidents, or Idaho could consider legislation governing the site of hazardous waste facilities. And Stokes discussed the option of banning altogether the disposal of hazardous waste in Idaho.
You could look at even banning the disposal of hazardous waste by landfilling outright if you wanted to. We think that there are some difficulties with that notion. If you look at the need for dealing with hazardous waste management on a national scale, it may be that kind of action should be dealt with on a national level so that the alternatives are in place before the states drive that alternative out of business. But on the other hand, that still is something that you could do if you chose to.
Concerns about the transportation of hazardous waste were voiced several times today. A Federal Highway Administration official told the committee about several recent hazardous waste accidents in Idaho. And Bob Chipkovitz said tougher laws are needed in Idaho to deal with the transportation of waste.
Hazardous materials in general, incidents have occurred in other places in the state besides just looking at the waste when they come into the site. Problems such as up in Coeur d'Alene, at one of the port of entries, there was an alkali substance which leaked from a container, was leaking from a truck. And the Department of Law Enforcement and Idaho Transportation Department jointly worked on that. Highway 12, there was an incident involving hazardous material. In the Pocatello area, some leaking hazardous waste. In Montpelier during transportation. So statewide, I think it's important that law enforcement agencies be equipped and able to recognize the hazardous waste and hazardous materials.
Idaho Congressman Larry Craig was also a witness today, saying he feels comfortable now with where the state is concerning the EnviroSafe situation. Craig says Idaho has a unique opportunity right now.
I think Idaho is unique and has a unique opportunity as it relates to some of our eastern seaboard states who are in a much different posture, in the sense that they're beginning to find out that landfills that were in place for 25 or 30 years are now causing tremendous problems. And so it's a question now of cleanup in those states, whereas in Idaho, it's a question of, are we doing it right now so that we won't have those problems down the road 25 or 30 years?
But as producer Gary Richardson found later in talking with 2 Owyhee County residents, concerns about EnviroSafe have not abated.
No, I'm not comfortable at all with where we're at right now. I feel he had a lot of good ideas for the future, but the compliances and all the things that they're doing right now gives no assurance to our future well-being.
No, I'm not comfortable at all. We still haven't heard what's going on out there. We keep talking about the integrity of the site. Well, we haven't heard anything about the integrity of the site. We still are dubious and very questioning of the integrity. They say maybe next week we'll get some reports on the water under the site. I guess it's just frustrating. Why is it taking so long?
What do you think we should do?
Well, if you go out there and look at the many thousands of barrels that they've been unable to dispose of because of this disruption, the fine and so forth, I would think the absolute first thing they should do is as the governor suggested, let's put a moratorium on it until we get these test results in. If those chemicals are indeed leaking into the water, it should be stopped instead of continually adding to it. Let's find out.
More on what the Idaho legislature might be doing soon in this area of hazardous waste disposal, and for that we go first tonight to Representative Vard Chatburn. He co-chairs that special legislative committee and is chairman as well of the House Resources and Conservation Committee. Representative Chatburn, United Press International is reporting this afternoon that basically your committee found the subject of hazardous waste disposal to be so big and so complicated that you just haven't had time to make some specific recommendations yet. Is that a fair summary of where you're at this point?
I think so, Mark. Early last fall, the Speaker and the Pro Tem, after much public concern, decided that we should have this special interim committee of the legislature to take a look at the hazardous waste problems of the state of Idaho and make recommendations to the legislature. It had been my hope as co-chairman of that committee that we would be able to make some sort of recommendation at the beginning of this session of the legislature. But it surprised me the amount of material that had to be studied and the problems as they exist, while not insurmountable in my opinion, they need some deliberate consideration.
Well, let me ask you, Mr. Chatburn, in sort of general terms, you saw what Lee Stokes and heard what Lee Stokes was saying there today to your committee, the state environmental chief. The sorts of things that he outlined there, is that the kind of thing that your committee is looking at? Such things as fees on the disposal of this material, better handle on how it's transported, some of those kinds of things?
Up until this time, we have listened to the EPA, Mr. McKee and Lee Stokes from the H&W, and his recommendations this afternoon haven't been considered yet by the committee. And how many of the committee would like to pursue that, I have no idea exactly. But we do intend to come up with something. I'm sure of that.
There is then, in your opinion, more general desire on the part of members of the legislature to get more deeply into this subject than perhaps the state of Idaho has in the past. Is that fair to say?
I'm positive of that. Since the recent releases of the press and everything, all the folks in the state, not only those who live in Grandview, are quite concerned. And of course, as constituents, they in turn have impressed that upon their legislators, and I think it'll have some pretty good action.
Well, let me ask you finally, Mr. Chatburn, when would you think that your committee would have some specific things to recommend to the full legislature?
I would hope by the latter part of January.
Okay, and you'll be meeting again when, after the session begins?
We'll meet again after the session begins, probably the first week of January. It'll be early on before the committee members get tied up with other work.
We'll come back, sir. Thank you very much. Let's turn now to an update of the EnviroSafe situation from the Environmental Protection Agency's top official in Idaho. That's Lynn McKee, the State Director of EPA. Mr. McKee, Congressman Craig said in so many words to that committee today, and said it on this broadcast last night, that he is generally satisfied with the progress being made to understand the situation at EnviroSafe, make what corrective steps are necessary. Is that a fair characterization of EPA's position at this point, too?
I think it is. Over the last month, since the last time we reviewed this situation, we have been primarily involved with monitoring of the order that we issued on November 23rd, and that had to do with a number of the things that have been heard on this program already, the burying of liquid waste and the correcting of procedures to see that that doesn't happen again, and a number of other issues which have been dealt with by the company according to the order that we issued, and at this point in time they appear to have fulfilled, at least they have supplied us with their proposed plans for almost all of those issues, and in some cases they have corrected, have some procedures in place which we feel will correct that problem.
Yet Mr. Hodges, as you heard on the videotape a moment ago, says he's a little surprised that things are taking as long as they are. Should he be surprised?
Well, I don't know if he should be surprised or not. I can't respond to his frame of reference on time, but those things take time to do, and it's not one of those things where you can just all of a sudden take an action. It's a matter of process of law, and it's a matter of a very scientific approach on many of these things. It takes time to accomplish those kind of things.
Well, as I recall, the last time you were here, Mr. McKee, you said that it would be unreasonable to place some sort of a moratorium on the shipment of additional waste, as again Mr. Hodges mentioned on the videotape. Still the position? No need for that?
We don't see the need, as described, I believe, by Mr. Hodges, for a ban on additional waste at this point in time. The problems that are most likely to occur down there right at this point in time related to the groundwater are wastes which were placed in the silos sometime before the existing operation was in place. And whether we stop incoming waste or not won't make any difference to that situation. Okay.
Let me ask you to shift gears here just a little bit and reflect just briefly on some of the things that Representative Chatburn was talking about a moment ago. His committee obviously is trying to decide what they should recommend that the state of Idaho be doing in this area. Can you give me just a brief checklist of some things that you think the state of Idaho ought to be doing in this area?
Well, certainly the ones that Dr. Stokes described in his presentation, I think some of those are very important and ought to be considered by the legislature. I think we have concern for instance, the limitation on the quantities of waste that are regulated by RCRA. For instance, the 2,200 pounds limitation.
RCRA is the federal law that governs.
Sorry, the Federal Hazardous Waste Law, right? And at this present time, many generators of hazardous waste are not regulated, and there are sizable quantities of hazardous waste going into unauthorized, or I should say unregulated, landfills and other disposal sites, and those things are a concern to us. The transportation of hazardous waste and hazardous materials are a great concern to us, even though that's primarily the Department of Transportation's problem. They're still a concern to us.
Finally, Mr. McKee, let me ask you about, there's some suggestion, I don't know how serious it is, but it's being suggested by some, that maybe the state shouldn't be too concerned about getting involved in this area, that they ought to leave it to you, ought to leave it to EPA. Is that a bad idea?
Yes, I'll answer that one forthright.
Okay.
I think that's probably not in the best interest of the state of Idaho. There are certain functions dealing with hazardous waste that probably should be handled on a federal basis because of the nationwide scope of the problem. There are a number of other things which are probably much better handled by the state. They are the ones who have the law enforcement people. They're the ones who have a broader distribution of people who deal with environmental problems. They have offices throughout the state. They also are responsible to the people that live here. And to the extent that they can be delegated to the state, I think that's where they should go. I think that was the intent of Congress. That's the intent of the administration at this time.
We'll come back, sir. Thank you. I mentioned earlier the action last night of the Owyhee County Commission, which passed again an ordinance requiring the EnviroSafe operation to pay fees on waste disposed in Owyhee County and to disclose information about what's being disposed of. Owyhee County Prosecuting Attorney Clayton Anderson is here now to tell us more about that. Mr. Anderson, why did the Commission take that action?
Well, the Commission basically felt that we needed to take the initiative in this area, and rather than wait for action to be taken, it was felt that the responsible thing was to take action and deal with the problem in the manner that we felt not only gut reaction, but also based on the scientific evidence that was presented to us from an engineering firm and also from our environmental safety officer.
As you well know, there's great legal question about whether you can do what your ordinance proposes to do. Are you confident you can?
I think we're more than adequately prepared to substantiate our abilities to sustain any court challenge, and would welcome any court challenge.
Well, let me ask you, as you view this situation now and how it's developed over just, say, the last month or two, are you satisfied that things are moving along rapidly enough, quickly enough?
I don't think that myself, the commissioners, almost anyone I've talked to in Owyhee County or outside of Owyhee County feels that the thing is going along fast enough. The problem being is that we've created a kind of a monster that nobody really has a handle to, and we just are very frustrated by dealing with that type of situation.
What about this continuing talk of a moratorium, placing some ban on additional shipments there? Where do you come down on that issue at this point?
We believe that that's a very appropriate measure to be taken until the results from the side are taken. Our understanding is that there's going to be an expeditious situation with regards to the examination of those wells, the monitoring wells that have been installed.
Now, these are wells, we should just mention, that have been drilled just recently to do some water testing.
Yes, not to mention the fact that there already is a rather large inventory on the site, and the fact that the weather conditions at the present time, according to our understanding, curtail the abilities to dispose of certain types of wastes that are liquid in solidified form because of the weather conditions.
Yet, Mr. McKee just said, and Congressman Craig has alluded to the fact that things are moving along about as well as can be expected. I guess you just disagree with that.
Well, it's all a matter of relative to what. You know, they don't make any reference as to as be expected. Maybe it's because they've been in the federal system and can appreciate its awkwardness and slowness on occasion, whereas residents of Owyhee County do not appreciate it.
Well, let me ask you finally, Mr. Anderson, as an elected official, a person who has to have some pulse on the public feeling in your county, how do most people feel about this situation at this point?
I think that they have more questions than they have answers, and that's the problem. Mr. Ashby today indicated that there was a lot of information and a lot of also misinformation, and that is...
Would you just say that's Ed Ashby from EnviroSafe, who we'll be talking to in just a minute?
Yes, and that is a problem, but there hasn't been a conduit or flow of information that is credible. I think that's one of the reasons that the Governor's Blue Ribbon Committee was appointed. You know, we already have the state and EPA who are supposed to be the vanguards over the environment. I think that they wanted to take that situation and put it into some people that people would feel that there was some trust and credibility in.
Well, where is the system broken down that that information is not available, do you think?
Well, the system is broken down for a number of reasons. I think one of them is the financial situation. I think that what the state is presently attempting to do and what EPA is presently attempting to do isn't just hazardous waste. The Division of Environment has many other duties, the same way with EPA. This isn't the only duty that they have to perform, and I think it's made a financial strain not only on manpower resources but also financial resources.
We'll come back, sir. Thank you. Finally now, some response to all of this from Ed Ashby. Mr. Ashby is the president of EnviroSafe Services Incorporated, the owners of the Owyhee County Waste Disposal Facility. First, Mr. Ashby, a response to the Commissioner's ordinance which they passed last night. How do you feel about that?
difficult for me to respond at this point in time because we have not been given a copy of the ordinance. We know only that the one provision contained therein, which Mr. Anderson communicated to the committee earlier today, was the 1 cent per pound fee on waste materials presumably received at our site.
How would you feel about that?
I think in the overall scheme of things, that would represent probably the most onerous fee imposed by any governmental body any place in the United States at this point in time as a tax on hazardous waste disposal.
Too much, then?
Too much.
How about requiring more, as I mentioned it in shorthand, and we'll ask Mr. Anderson about more about it, requiring your company to make more disclosure about what sort of material is being disposed of and where it's coming from? Just in a general philosophical sense, how do you feel about that?
In a general sense, I guess I have no problem with that. My only concern would be the amount of information that the county is requesting. Again, I have not seen that. If they want a listing of the types of waste materials that we're receiving, and in general the states from which we are receiving those wastes as opposed to the actual generators, then I don't have a major problem. If, however, they wish to have generator information, I would have a problem because that would represent a ready customer list to my competition.
So that's proprietary information that you need to be in business?
It's not proprietary information in the sense that they could not get it from other sources. It is generally available from the manifest reports that are filed in other EPA regions.
But it's the kind of information you wouldn't readily give because your competition would like to know it.
Exactly.
As well. Okay. Let me shift to this subject of whether this process of dealing with the problems that you've had at that site has moved rapidly enough. Obviously, Mr. Anderson doesn't think so. Respond to that.
Well, I think I would have to couch my response in the same terms that Mr. McKee of the EPA couched his in that the problem, if any, from the silo disposal of waste in the past has been there for going on 10 years at this point. To arbitrarily...
This is the material that's been put in the old Titan missile silos.
Correct. Okay. And I must point out that those Titan missile silos were closed prior to our acquisition of the former Westcon organization in 1981. In fact, they were closed in 1980, at least a year before we acquired the facility. Groundwater, which is the main concern and should be the main concern of most of the Owyhee County residents, moves relatively slowly. If there is any contamination, it is most likely coming from those silos. We have no indication from any of the work that either we, the EPA, or the state H&W have done that indicates that contamination exists, or in fact that there is any imminent threat to health or the environment. As Mr. Anderson indicated, we have completed now the installation of the balance of the groundwater monitoring wells, which are intended to prove, hopefully once and for all, that there is no contamination emanating or leaving from the site boundaries. We have yet to put in monitoring wells adjacent to the silos, which will indicate whether or not those old silos are a source of potential contamination.
Let me ask you finally, Mr. Ashby, about this. Again, Mr. Anderson mentioned it. It's been mentioned by people who live in that area. They're concerned that they're not getting, they don't feel like they're getting the kind of information that they should be. There's a lot of questions, not much in the way of answers at this point. Is that an unfair characterization of the situation?
I think that in a past time period there was a hesitancy on the part of the company to release certain information until we had a better idea as to why Owyhee County thought that they needed that information. I think in the last 6 weeks to 2 months that we as a company have gone a long way toward opening up hopefully a reasonable dialogue between ourselves and Owyhee County. If there is an insufficiency of information, I think that the county should identify what information it is they want and the time period in which they would like to see it.
Okay. Well, let me open it up on that point. Mr. Anderson? Reasonable request?
We subpoenaed the information of all the hydrological data that the company had in its possession. We do not have what we feel is all the information that they have. Or if all the information that they gave us is what they have, then it's deficient.
So this is information that would let you make some determination about whether the water is contaminated.
That's correct. They've indicated today before the committee that they had a large staff which included professional individuals, engineers, hydrological evaluators, and we haven't seen any of their reports, anything justifying review or independent verification by our engineer.
Mr. Ashby?
I think that, if I may back up a little bit, the installation of the groundwater monitoring wells that I indicated we had just completed last week is now finished. There is a somewhat lengthy procedure required to adequately flush out those wells to get the formation down there yielding the water cleaned up and ready for sampling to determine whether in fact contamination exists. The type of analysis that then needs to be performed is run on a very, very sophisticated analytical machine, which is referred to in the trade as the GCMS. Routinely, those types of tests, because of the cleanup preparations, because of the levels of contamination or concentrations of chemical parameters that they're looking for, which is down in the part per billion, part per trillion range, take anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, depending on the laboratory that you use. As I indicated to the Governor's Committee yesterday, I intended to contact the independent firm who we have selected to run those analyses and see if we could expedite their analytical procedure.
Okay.
Now, I have not gotten confirmation as to how short we can cut that.
Mr. Anderson, Mr. Ashby says your 1 cent per pound fee would be the most onerous in the country.
Well, we have to look at the situation in Hawaii County. You know, what the rest of the country has, I don't believe that's an accurate statement, but we have no training, we have no safety equipment, we have no fund to allow for any mini-fund type spill. At present time, the figures that were disclosed today, the average cleanup situation costs $6.3 million. So I don't think that our fee is outrageous. We've got an inspector now that we have to salary. We'll have additional staff that we'll have to do. We'll have engineering fees to review and verify documents, etc.
So it's not out of line. Mr. Ashby, just a quick comment?
My only comment is that it's the highest fee charged to any disposal facility in the United States.
Let me, just in the brief time that remains, ask you, Mr. Ashby, for a comment on what you think Representative Chatburn's committee ought to be doing, what the state of Idaho ought to be doing in this area. Should they be looking at a fee on perhaps both the generators and the disposers of this material?
I think that the purpose of the committee is multiple. I think their challenge is great. The first major decision that the committee has to make is whether or not they want Idaho to seek primacy from the federal government and in fact run their own hazardous waste management program, or whether to defer that back to
How do you answer that?
EPA. I'm a strong believer personally in states' right. I think that the people who live in a state should have the dominant control of how they live in that state, their work.
Okay. Let me just go back to Mr. Chatburn just briefly on that. Is that the feeling that the legislature has now, do you think, Mr. Chatburn, that the state really ought to be in this job?
Well, last year we passed that statute, the hazardous waste statute for the state, thinking that we would gain primacy. And I think the majority of the legislature wants the state to do the job.
Okay, I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. It's such a big subject, we don't have hardly enough time to talk about it. Mr. Chatburn, Mr. Anderson, thank you, and Mr. McKee and Mr. Ashby, thank you, sir.
Quite welcome.
That's our time for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.